The Tetons had been calling to me for years, and when we finally set out for Death Canyon Shelf, I had no idea just how intense the experience would be. It was the kind of trip where everything that could go wrong seemed to, but somehow, by sheer luck or stubbornness, we made it through. Looking back, I can say it was the best trip I've ever been on. But in the moment, there were times I thought we wouldn't make it out at all. We started our hike in good spirits, the dry summer air pressing down on us as we climbed. The sky was a solid, cloudless blue, and the heat bounced off the exposed rock, making everything feel even hotter than it was. The first few miles were manageable, but as we climbed higher, the lack of water started becoming a problem. Every stream we passed on the map was dry in person. We'd counted on these water sources, and with the temperature hovering around 90 degrees, we were sweating out what little hydration we had. My husband had taken on the heavier pack, and I could see it wearing on him. He wasn't the type to complain, but his pace was slowing, and he kept wiping sweat from his face with a shaking hand. When the clouds started building on the horizon, his whole demeanor changed. I could tell he was worried. We were above tree line now, and if a storm rolled in, we'd have nowhere to hide from the lightning. He started pushing the pace, driving himself forward despite the weight of the pack and the heat bearing down on him. I kept my mouth shut, but I could see what was happening. He was pushing too hard, and he wasn't drinking enough. When he finally stopped, swaying slightly, I knew he was in trouble. His face was pale despite the heat. His breathing was shallow, and his lips were cracked. We checked the map. There was a bold blue line ahead, a stream that had to have water. It was about a mile further. He wasn't in any shape to keep moving, so I made the call. I left him with our gear and went ahead to get water. I moved fast, scanning the landscape as I walked. The last hikers we'd seen had been hours ago, and it felt like we were the only people left in the mountains. When I reached the stream, I almost wanted to cry with relief. There was water, moving and clear. I pulled out the filter, kneeling by the edge to start filling our bottles. Then I saw it. A little brown head popped up across the stream, about 20 feet away. My heart stopped. Another head appeared, then another. A mother grizzly with cubs. I knew what I had to do. I stood up slowly, made noise, and kept my movements deliberate. I didn't run. I didn't stare. My whole body was screaming at me to panic, to bolt, to do something, but I forced myself to follow the script. The bear watched me, her ears forward, alert. She didn't charge. She didn't make a move toward me. Eventually, she turned and led her cubs away. I stayed rooted to the spot, my breath coming in short gasps. I was completely alone, miles from safety, and I'd just come face to face with one of the most dangerous animals in North America. If she had decided I was a threat, there wouldn't have been anything I could do. I forced myself to finish filtering the water, my hands shaking so badly I could barely work the pump. When I finally made it back to my husband, he was worse off than before. He drank as much as he could handle, but it took time for his strength to return. The storm never actually hit us, but the fear of it had pushed him past his limit. That night, as we lay in the tent, I couldn't stop replaying the moment by the stream. The way the bear had looked at me, the way my body had frozen in place. The knowledge that for a few seconds, I had been at the mercy of something so much more powerful than me. The next day, the weather turned. We woke up to dark clouds rolling in fast. It was late in the season, and we knew there was a chance of storms, but nothing could have prepared us for what came next. We were still on the shelf when the first rumbles of thunder started. Within minutes, the sky was a tangled mess of lightning, flashing so fast and so often it felt like a strobe light. The air reeked of ozone, thick and electric. The strikes were so close that the sound of them hitting the ground was nearly simultaneous with the flash. We crouched in the tent, trying to make ourselves as small as possible, barely daring to breathe. Every hair on my body felt like it was standing on end. It lasted for what felt like forever. The storm was directly over us, and there was nowhere to go. We could only sit and hope we weren't in the wrong place at the wrong time. At some point, I realized something strange was happening. It was brighter outside, much brighter than it should have been. For a split second, I thought it was a fire, that maybe one of the lightning strikes had ignited the dry grass. But when I unzipped the tent and looked out, I saw the ground covered in 4 inches of snow. It had happened in less than 30 minutes. My hands were stiff with cold, my breath coming in white clouds. The sudden change from intense heat to deep cold felt unreal, like something out of a dream. My husband and I looked at each other, neither of us able to believe what we were seeing. The rest of the trip followed the same pattern. Every day, something terrifying happened. A hailstorm hit while we were on an exposed ridge, the ice pelting us so hard it left bruises. The temperatures swung wildly, and hypothermia became a real threat. More than once, I caught myself wondering if we'd made a mistake coming out here so late in the season. But somehow, we made it through. The morning we hiked out, the Tetons were glowing with fresh snow, the sky a brilliant, endless blue. Everything looked peaceful, untouched, as if the mountains hadn't tried to kill us at every turn. As we descended, I kept thinking about the bear, the storm, the exhaustion, the fear. How close we had come to things going wrong in ways we couldn't have fixed. But I also thought about how alive I had felt. How every single moment had been sharper, clearer, more real than anything I had experienced in a long time. It was the best trip I've ever been on. But I don't know if I'd ever do it again. I've always loved camping alone. There's something about being deep in the wilderness, far from roads and other people, that makes me feel more alive than anything else. Out there, it's just you and the land. No distractions, no noise, no worries beyond keeping yourself fed, warm, and safe. I had done it for years, ever since I was a teenager. I knew how to read a map, how to purify water, how to set up camp in a way that would keep animals away. I wasn't some amateur. I had been in all kinds of places, thick forests, barren deserts, high mountains, and I never felt uneasy. Until this trip. This was the first time I ever felt truly vulnerable out there. I had planned the trip for months, a full week in a remote valley, deep in a national forest where few people went. I had found the spot on an old topographic map. No trails leading in, no roads anywhere nearby. Just a deep cut of land surrounded by ridges and dense trees. The kind of place where no one would stumble across you by accident. That's what I wanted. I packed carefully: tent, sleeping bag, enough food for the week, a water filter, a knife, a hatchet, extra clothes. My GPS was fully charged, but I had a paper map and compass as backup. I was prepared. The first 2 days were exactly what I had hoped for. The valley was beautiful, untouched, the kind of place that felt like it had been waiting for me. I found a good spot near a small stream, set up camp, and spent my days exploring. I saw fresh deer tracks, found a few old fallen trees covered in moss, even spotted a hawk circling high above the ridge. At night, the stars were so bright they barely looked real. The fire crackled, the cool air settled in, and I felt completely at peace. That changed on the 3rd night. I had been sitting by the fire, staring into the flames, listening to the usual night sounds. The distant hoot of an owl, the rustling of small animals moving through the underbrush. The kind of sounds I had heard 100 times before. Then, out of nowhere, everything went silent. It wasn't immediate. The noises faded, one by one, like someone was slowly turning down the volume of the forest. The chirping insects stopped. The movement in the underbrush stopped. Even the wind seemed to disappear. I noticed it right away, but I didn't move. I just sat there, staring into the fire, my body suddenly tense. I told myself it was nothing. Maybe a predator was nearby, a bobcat, maybe even a bear. Sometimes, when a large animal moves through, the smaller creatures go quiet. It made sense, but something about it felt wrong. I slowly turned my head, scanning the darkness beyond the firelight. Nothing, just trees and shadows. I tried to shake it off. I forced myself to relax, to breathe normally. I added more wood to the fire, making the flames jump higher, pushing back the dark. And then I heard it. A single footstep. Not a deer, not a raccoon. A footstep. Close. I stayed completely still, my heart pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. My knife was in my pocket, but I didn't move to grab it. I didn't want to make a sound. I listened. The woods were silent again. For a long time, I didn't move. I just stared into the darkness, every nerve in my body on edge. But there was nothing. No more footsteps.
No rustling. No breathing.
After what felt like hours, the normal sounds of the forest slowly returned. The insects started chirping again. A bird called out somewhere in the distance. The wind picked up, rustling the leaves. I let out a slow breath. I convinced myself I had imagined it, that I had let the silence get to me, had turned some normal forest sound into something bigger in my mind. I forced myself to move, to act normal. I banked the fire for the night, crawled into my tent, zipped it up tight. I lay there listening. Nothing. Eventually, I fell asleep. The next morning, I woke up early. I crawled out of my tent, stretched, and looked around. Everything was exactly as I had left it. My food bag was still hanging in the tree, untouched. My gear was still where I had put it. But something felt off. I couldn't explain it. The air felt heavier. The trees seemed taller, like the valley had closed in around me overnight. I tried to ignore it. I made breakfast, packed a small bag, and decided to go exploring. I hiked for most of the day, moving up toward the ridge that overlooked the valley. I wanted to get a better view, maybe spot any interesting landmarks. But as I climbed higher, I started to notice something strange. No animal tracks. In a place this wild, this remote, you always see tracks. Deer, rabbits, raccoons, even bears. But there was nothing. No prints in the dirt. No broken branches. No signs of life. The woods were dead. That uneasy feeling in my gut got worse. But I pushed on. When I reached the top of the ridge, I stopped and looked out over the valley. The view was incredible, thick trees stretching for miles, the stream cutting through the land like a silver ribbon. My campsite was just a tiny speck below. And then I saw something that made my stomach drop. Clearing. A perfect, circular clearing in the trees, far on the other side of the valley. It was too round, too precise, like someone had carved it out of the forest on purpose. I hadn't seen it on my map. There were no old logging roads, no trails leading to it. It was just there. I didn't like it. I turned and started heading back to camp, moving faster than before. By the time I got back, the sun was starting to set. I made a fire, cooked dinner, tried to act normal. But that night, the silence came back. And this time, it didn't go away. I sat there by the fire, gripping my knife, staring out into the trees. I didn't hear any footsteps this time, but I could feel it. Something was out there, watching. The fire felt too small, the darkness too big. I knew I wasn't staying another night. The first light, I packed up. I moved quickly, stuffing everything into my pack without care. I wanted to be out of that valley. I hiked fast, barely stopping to rest. The whole time I felt it, that presence just out of sight. By mid-afternoon, I reached the ridge where I had come down into the valley days before. I stopped, turning for one last look. The valley was empty, silent, but I knew, deep in my gut, that I had never been alone. I don't know who or what was out there, but I know one thing. Something was watching me, and I don't think it wanted me to leave. I always liked being out in the woods alone. Not because I thought of myself as some kind of survival expert, but because I liked the quiet. The kind of quiet you only get when you're deep enough into the trees that even the sound of distant cars is gone. When it's just the wind, the creaking of branches, the occasional snap of something small moving through the undergrowth. It was the kind of silence that made me feel like the world outside didn't exist. That's why I went camping alone that weekend. I had time off, the weather was good, and I wanted to be out there for a while, not just a quick overnight trip. I packed my gear carefully. A good tent, plenty of food, water filtration, extra socks, and a solid knife. I had my GPS, but I also brought a map and compass just in case. I wasn't the type to take stupid risks. I just wanted to disappear into the woods for a few days, get away from everything. The place I chose was a national forest way out past any of the popular campsites. I planned to hike in about 10 miles, far enough that I wouldn't run into other people. I liked being completely alone when I camped. No strangers stomping around, no distant voices, no reminders of other people at all. Just me and the woods. The first day was good. I hiked most of the way in without any problems, taking my time, stopping to enjoy the view when I reached a ridge that overlooked a long stretch of forest. The trees were thick, mostly pine, with some birch mixed in. I found a good spot near a small creek, flat ground with enough open space to set up camp, but still surrounded by trees for cover. Felt just right. I got my tent up, gathered some wood for a fire, and cooked a simple meal as the sun went down. It was peaceful, exactly what I wanted. I sat by the fire for a while, letting my mind settle into that quiet, empty state that only happens when you've left behind everything that usually fills your head. I slept well that night, the kind of deep sleep that only comes after a long day of walking. The second day, I decided to explore a little. I didn't go far, just followed the creek for a few miles, taking my time. I saw a few deer, watched a hawk circling overhead, found some old animal bones half buried in the dirt. The kind of things that remind you that the woods have their own life going on, whether you're there or not. I went back to camp in the afternoon and spent some time reinforcing my setup, tightening the lines on my tent, making sure my food was stored properly so nothing would get into it. I had a small fire again that night, but I let it burn out early. The stars were bright, and I wanted to just lie back and look at them for a while. That was the first time I noticed something that felt off. It was small at first, just this feeling that I wasn't alone. Not in a supernatural way, not like I was being watched by some unseen force. Just a simple physical instinct, like the way you know when someone is standing behind you, even if they aren't making a sound. I sat up, scanning the trees. Nothing moved. No sound except for the usual night noises, the rustling of leaves, the occasional chirp of an insect, the distant hoot of an owl. I told myself I was just being jumpy. I hadn't seen a single person since I left the trailhead. There was no reason anyone would be out here. Still, I didn't sleep as well that night. I woke up a few times, listening, but I never heard anything unusual. The third day, I went even farther from camp. I followed an old game trail up into the hills, just to see where it led. I didn't bring my full pack, just some water and a snack, figuring I'd be back before long. The hike was harder than I expected, steeper, the ground uneven. I had to climb over fallen logs, push through thick underbrush. Took me longer than I planned. I found something strange up there, a clearing, but not the natural kind. Someone had been there. There were old fire pits, long since abandoned, and the remains of wooden structures, half collapsed and rotting. Not cabins, nothing that solid, more like rough lean-tos, the kind you'd build if you were staying out here for a while but not permanently. It looked old, but not ancient. The wood was gray and splintered, but not completely decayed. Someone had used this place maybe years ago, maybe longer. I felt that same unease again, that sense that I wasn't alone. I turned back and started down, moving faster this time. I wanted to be back at camp before dark. When I got there, something was wrong. Nothing was missing, nothing was damaged, but it was wrong. My tent flap was open. I knew I had zipped it shut. My food bag was still tied up in a tree, untouched. My gear was all in place, but something had been there. I could feel it. I checked for tracks but didn't find anything clear. The ground was too hard in most places, covered in pine needles. But I found one thing, just outside my camp, near a tree, piece of rope. Not mine. It was old, frayed, but not falling apart. Just a short length of it, lying there like it had been dropped. I didn't make a fire that night. I didn't want to draw attention. I sat in the dark, listening. Every little sound made my nerves jump. I kept my knife close, even though I knew it wouldn't do much if someone really wanted to hurt me. I barely slept. By the fourth day, I knew I had to leave. I packed up as soon as it was light enough to see. I wanted to be out of those woods before anything else happened. The hike back felt different. Every time I heard a noise, I turned fast, expecting to see someone, but I never did. I never saw a single person the whole way out. I made it back to my car by early afternoon. I locked the doors the second I got inside, even though I knew it was ridiculous. I sat there for a long time, just breathing, my hands tight on the steering wheel. I don't know who was out there. Maybe no one. Maybe it was just my own paranoia, my mind turning shadows into something more. But I don't think so. I've camped alone plenty of times since then, but never in that forest, and never that deep into the woods. Some places aren't as empty as they seem. I've always been comfortable alone in the wilderness. It's something I've done for years, packing my gear, hiking deep into the woods, setting up camp far away from trails, away from people. There's a peace to it that you don't get anywhere else. No city noise, no distractions, just the quiet of nature. This trip was supposed to be like all the others. I had planned for a full week, deep in a national forest, somewhere without any established campsites. I wanted isolation. I wanted to wake up with nothing around me but trees, to sit by a fire at night without seeing a single light in the distance. That was the whole point. I picked an area I had never been to before, an expanse of dense forest that stretched for miles, with few trails and even fewer visitors. I spent weeks planning, making sure I had everything I needed. My pack was loaded carefully: tent, sleeping bag, food, water purification, a knife, a small hatchet, extra clothes. My GPS and map were ready, though I rarely needed them. I had been doing this long enough that I could navigate by instinct. The first day went exactly as expected. I parked my car at a small pull-off near the edge of the forest, shouldered my pack, and started hiking. The trail was barely marked, overgrown in places, the kind of path that only saw a handful of people each year. That was good. I wanted it that way. I hiked for most of the day, pushing deep into the woods, moving off the trail when I found a spot that felt right. It was a flat clearing near a small creek, surrounded by thick trees. A good, secluded place. I set up camp, got a fire going, cooked a simple meal. The air was cool, the woods quiet except for the occasional rustling of wind through the leaves. That night, I slept without trouble. The second day, I explored. I followed the creek for a while, looking for anything interesting, animal tracks, unusual plants, anything that caught my eye. I wasn't in a hurry. The whole point of a trip like this was to take my time, to slow down. By midday, I had looped back to my camp and spent some time reinforcing things, tying my food bag high in a tree to keep it away from animals, making sure my tent was secure, gathering extra firewood. It was a routine I had done dozens of times before. It was that evening when I first noticed something that felt off. I had just finished eating, letting the fire burn low as the sun dipped below the trees. The sky was fading to deep blue, the air cooling fast. That was when I got the feeling, that quiet, crawling sensation on the back of my neck, like I was being watched. I scanned the trees, but there was nothing, just the same dense woods stretching into the distance. I tried to shake it off. It was probably just my mind playing tricks. When you're alone in the wilderness, your senses get sharper, more aware of every small sound, every shadow. It was easy to imagine things that weren't there, but the feeling didn't go away. I sat still for a long time listening. The woods weren't silent. There was the usual background noise of insects, the occasional distant hoot of an owl, but something felt different. The air felt heavier, like it was pressing down on me. Eventually, I forced myself to move. I added some wood to the fire, stretching out the warmth, and then crawled into my tent. I lay there listening. At some point, I fell asleep. The next morning, I woke up early, just as the first light filtered through the trees. The fire had burned out completely, leaving only cold ashes. Everything was where I had left it except for one thing, my food bag. It was still hanging in the tree, but it had been untied. The rope was still there, dangling, but the knot had been undone, the bag sitting on the ground beneath it. That wasn't normal. I had tied it securely the night before. Even if an animal had managed to reach it, they wouldn't have undone the knot. They would have torn the bag open, scattered the food. But the bag was intact. Someone had been in my camp. I stood there for a long time, staring at the bag, my mind running through possibilities. Maybe a passing hiker had found my camp and decided to mess with my stuff. But that didn't make sense. Who would be way out here? And why just untie the bag and leave it? I checked around the area but didn't see any footprints, no obvious signs of anyone being there. But the forest floor was covered in pine needles, soft and undisturbed. Someone could have walked through without leaving a clear trail. I forced myself to stay calm. Maybe it had been the wind. Maybe I hadn't tied the knot as well as I thought. I gathered my food, retied the bag, and went about my day. But the feeling didn't go away. That evening, I built a bigger fire than usual. Not just for warmth, but for light. I didn't like the idea of sitting in the dark, not after that morning. The woods felt different now. I wasn't just alone. I was being watched. I could feel it. I stayed awake longer than usual, staring into the trees, listening. Every small sound made my skin crawl. Eventually, I forced myself to get into my tent. I lay there, gripping my knife, every muscle tense. At some point, I must have drifted off, because I woke up to a sound, a soft rustling, close. My heart pounded. I stayed completely still, barely breathing. The sound came again, movement just outside the tent. I didn't move, didn't make a sound. Then silence. Minutes passed. My ears strained for any hint of noise, but there was nothing, just the endless quiet of the woods. I didn't sleep after that. When the sun finally rose, I crawled out of the tent, scanning the area. There was nothing, no footprints, no sign that anyone had been there. But I knew. I packed up fast. My hands were shaking as I loaded my gear, stuffing everything into my pack without bothering to organize it. I wanted to be out of those woods. I moved quickly, following the route back to my car, barely stopping to rest. The whole way I felt it, that weight, that presence just out of sight. When I finally reached my car, I threw my pack inside, locked the doors, and sat there, catching my breath. My hands were still trembling. I don't know who was out there. I never saw them, never heard more than those small movements in the night. But I know they were there, and they were watching. I haven't camped alone since. I've always liked camping alone. Not in the way some people do, where they park their car at a campground and call it solitude. I mean real deep woods camping. No trails, no signs, no other people. Just me, my gear, and the wilderness. I thought I knew what I was doing. I had done it for years. I wasn't reckless, and I wasn't scared of the woods. But this trip changed how I see being alone out there. It started like any other. I had a week off work and wanted to get away. I chose a spot in a national forest, miles from any road, where the trees were thick and the land was untouched. There were no marked trails leading to where I was going, and that was exactly what I wanted. I spent days planning my route, making sure I had everything: tent, food, water filtration, extra clothes, my knife, a small hatchet. My GPS was charged, and I had a paper map as backup. I drove as far as I could, parked on the shoulder of an old dirt road, and started walking. The first day was normal. The forest was beautiful, the air cool, the smell of pine and damp earth filling my lungs. I moved at a steady pace, cutting through thick underbrush, using my compass to keep my bearings. By late afternoon, I found a good spot, a flat clearing near a slow-moving creek. I set up my tent, got a fire going, cooked a simple meal, and sat back, letting the quiet settle around me. This was what I loved most: the deep silence of the woods, broken only by the occasional rustling of leaves or the distant call of a bird. That night, I slept well. The second day, I explored. I didn't wander too far, just followed the creek, checked the area for anything interesting. I saw deer tracks, found an old fallen tree covered in moss, noticed a few birds I didn't recognize. Nothing unusual, just the peaceful, empty woods. I went back to camp in the afternoon, built up my fire, and cooked again. It was another quiet, uneventful evening. But that night, something woke me up. I wasn't sure what at first. I lay there in my sleeping bag, staring at the dark fabric of my tent, listening. The woods were quiet, too quiet. If you've spent enough time outside, you learn that true silence is rare. Even at night, there are sounds: the chirp of insects, the rustle of small animals moving through the underbrush. But now there was nothing, just dead, heavy silence. I listened harder, straining to hear past the thick quiet. And then, just barely, I heard it, a soft rustling, not the random, scattered noise of wind through leaves. This was different, slow, careful. Something was moving outside my tent. My breath slowed, my pulse hammering in my ears. I stayed still, gripping the handle of my knife inside my sleeping bag, waiting. The sound stopped. Minutes passed. The silence stretched on, pressing against my ears. Eventually, I convinced myself I had imagined it, that my half-asleep mind had turned the normal shifting of the forest into something more. I let out a slow breath, trying to calm myself, and then I heard it again, closer. I didn't move. I lay there for what felt like hours, every muscle tense. But the sound never came back. At some point, exhaustion won. I drifted in and out of sleep, my ears still straining for any noise. But the night stayed quiet. By morning, with sunlight filtering through the trees, the fear felt ridiculous. I got out of my tent, stretched, looked around. Everything was normal. My food bag was still tied up in a tree, untouched. My gear was exactly where I had left it. There were no tracks, no broken branches, nothing to prove anything had been there. I told myself it was just an animal, a raccoon maybe, or a deer passing through. I had scared myself for no reason, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something had been watching me. I decided to hike farther that day. I left my tent and most of my gear behind, taking only my knife, my compass, and a small pack with water and snacks. I walked for hours, moving through dense trees, climbing over fallen logs, pushing through thick underbrush. I kept my bearings, checking my compass regularly, making sure I could find my way back. And then I found it, a campsite, but not mine. It was an old one, long abandoned, hidden deep in the trees where no one should have been. The tent was still there, slumped and rotting, its fabric torn and sagging. The fire pit was filled with dirt and leaves, long cold. There were other things, too. A rusted knife, a broken lantern, a few cans of food, their labels faded and peeling. Someone had been here a long time ago, and they had left in a hurry. The tent was open, the sleeping bag inside still laid out, half-zipped. The food cans had been scattered, like someone had knocked them over. The whole place felt wrong. I stood there, staring at the scene, feeling that same creeping unease from the night before. Something had happened here, and whatever it was, whoever had camped here had never come back for their things. I backed away, turning to head back toward my own camp. I moved faster now, keeping my knife in my hand, my heart pounding. When I reached my tent, I stopped cold. The flap was open. I was sure I had zipped it shut before I left. I scanned the ground, looking for footprints, but the forest floor was thick with leaves and pine needles. No clear tracks. I stepped closer, slowly, my grip tightening on the knife. Inside, my gear was untouched. My sleeping bag was still there, my food bag still hanging in the tree. Nothing was missing, nothing was moved, but someone had been here. I felt it in my bones. The rest of the day, I stayed close to camp, listening, watching. Every rustle of leaves made me jump. Every shifting shadow set my nerves on edge. That night, I built the biggest fire I could. I sat with my back to a tree, my knife in my hand, waiting. The woods stayed silent. I didn't sleep. By morning, I had made my decision. I was leaving. I packed up fast, shoving everything into my bag without care. I didn't bother eating. I wanted to be gone before whatever was out there decided to come back. I moved quickly, retracing my route, pushing through the underbrush, barely stopping to rest. The whole time I felt it, that presence just out of sight, watching. I made it back to my car by mid-afternoon. I threw my pack inside, locked the doors, and sat there, my hands shaking on the wheel. I never found out who had camped there before me, never found out why they left so suddenly. And I didn't want to. All I know is that someone had been out there. Maybe they still were, and I wasn't supposed to see their camp. I haven't been back to that forest since, and I never camp alone anymore. I have camped alone for years. It started when I was in my early 20s, just a way to clear my head and get away from everything. I liked the solitude, the stillness, the feeling of being completely disconnected from the world. Over time, I got better at it, learned how to pack light, how to make a fire in the rain, how to keep myself safe. I had camped in deep forests, high mountains, dry deserts. I had never once felt unsafe. Until this trip. This was the first time I truly felt like I shouldn't have been out there. I had taken a week off work and wanted to spend it in the mountains, somewhere isolated. I found a national forest that wasn't too far from home but was big enough that I could go miles without seeing another person. I didn't want marked trails or designated campgrounds. I wanted to be alone, deep in the woods, where no one else would be. I planned carefully. I picked an area far from the main roads, a place with no established campsites, just raw forest. The terrain was steep in some places, full of old pine trees, rocky slopes, and narrow valleys. I had checked the maps, made sure there was a water source nearby, and packed everything I needed: tent, sleeping bag, enough food for the week, water filter, knife, hatchet. My GPS was fully charged, but I also had a paper map and compass. I drove up into the mountains early in the morning, following a narrow dirt road until it became too rough for my car. I pulled off to the side, grabbed my pack, and started hiking. The first day was peaceful. The air was cool, the smell of pine thick around me. I moved at a steady pace, cutting through the trees, using my compass to keep my bearings. I found a good spot by mid-afternoon, a small clearing near a slow-moving stream, surrounded by tall trees that blocked most of the wind. I set up camp quickly, My tent went up first, then I gathered wood for a fire. By the time the sun started setting, I had everything ready. I cooked a simple meal, sat by the fire, and listened to the quiet sounds of the forest. That night I slept well. The second day, I spent time exploring the area. I followed the stream for a while, checking for any signs of animals. I saw deer tracks, found a few fallen trees covered in moss, even spotted a hawk circling high above. The place felt untouched, like no one had been there in years. By the afternoon, I was back at camp. I built up the fire again, cooked dinner, and watched as the sky faded to black. That was the last normal night. The third day, things started feeling different. I woke up early, feeling strange. Not scared exactly, just uneasy, like something was off. The air felt heavier, the silence deeper. I shook it off, telling myself it was just my imagination. I ate breakfast, packed a small bag, and decided to hike farther up the valley. That was when I saw the first sign that something wasn't right. About a mile from my camp, I found an old fire pit. It wasn't mine. The rocks were still arranged in a circle, but the inside was filled with dirt and leaves, like it hadn't been used in years. That wasn't the strange part. The strange part was that there were no signs of a campsite, no tent stakes, no trash, no footprints. Just the fire pit, sitting alone in the middle of the woods. Felt wrong, like someone had been there a long time ago and had left in a hurry. I stood there for a long time, staring at it, before forcing myself to move on. By the time I got back to camp, the sun was setting. The uneasy feeling hadn't left. If anything, it had gotten worse. That night, I sat by the fire longer than usual. I kept looking out into the trees, listening. The forest was quiet, too quiet. At some point, I convinced myself I was just being paranoid. I put out the fire, crawled into my tent, and zipped it up tight. I woke up hours later, my heart pounding. At first, I didn't know what had woken me. I just lay there, frozen, listening. The woods were silent again. Then I heard it. A single footstep. Not an animal. Not the random creak of trees shifting in the wind. A footstep. Close. I didn't move. I held my breath, straining to hear past the sound of my own heartbeat. The step had come from near the edge of my camp, somewhere just outside the fire pit's ring of stones. The fire was out. The night was pitch black. I stayed like that for what felt like hours, every muscle in my body tense. But I didn't hear anything else. Eventually, I convinced myself it was nothing. Maybe a branch had fallen. Maybe a deer had wandered close. I told myself anything to keep from thinking about the alternative. I lay there, staring at the roof of my tent, listening. But the sound never came back. By morning, with sunlight streaming through the trees, the fear felt ridiculous. I crawled out of my tent, stretched, and looked around. My food bag was still hanging in the tree, untouched. My gear was exactly where I had left it. Nothing was missing, but something had been out there. I spent the day hiking again, trying to shake the unease. I went farther this time, up toward the ridge that overlooked the valley. From up there, I could see for miles, rolling hills, dense forest, no signs of people. And then I saw it, a second fire pit. Far below, near the edge of the trees. Just like the first one, old, abandoned, no signs of a campsite around it. I didn't like it. I turned and started heading back down, moving faster than before. When I got to camp, I stopped cold. The flap to my tent was open. I was sure I had zipped it shut before I left. I stood there for a long time, staring at it, my mind racing. I scanned the ground, looking for footprints, but the forest floor was thick with leaves and pine needles. Nothing was obvious. Slowly, I stepped closer. Inside, my sleeping bag was still there. My gear was still there. Nothing was missing. But I knew, deep in my gut, that someone had been there. That night, I didn't sleep. I sat by the fire, knife in hand, listening. The woods were silent again, but I could feel it. Something was watching me. The first light, I packed up. I moved quickly, shoving everything into my bag without care. I wanted to be out of that valley. I hiked fast, barely stopping to rest. The whole time I felt it, that presence just out of sight. By mid-afternoon, I reached my car. I threw my pack inside, locked the doors, and sat there, hands shaking on the wheel. I never found out who or what was out there, but I know one thing. I wasn't supposed to be there. I was about 14 or 15 when this happened. My family used to camp at a state park every summer, always in the same general area, always setting up our tents in the same familiar spots. It was one of those places that felt like a second home, somewhere I had been going since I was a kid, long enough that the layout of the trails, the look of the trees, and even the sounds of the forest at night had all become familiar. It was a place that felt safe, predictable in the way that only somewhere well-worn and well-loved can feel. Every summer, my friend and I had a tradition. We called it the ritual. Every night, once the sun went down and our parents were settled by the campfire, we would leave the glow of the campsite and walk into the woods. We had flashlights, but we liked the challenge of moving through the dark with them off, letting our eyes adjust to the dim light of the moon filtering through the trees. It was a game, a way to test ourselves, to prove we weren't scared, that we knew these woods well enough to move through them by memory and instinct alone. That night, we decided to push further than we had before. We weren't reckless, at least we didn't think so at the time, but there was always that quiet need to go just a little farther than before. It wasn't about getting lost. It was about seeing how deep we could go before we felt the first stirrings of unease, before the dark started to feel like something alive rather than just the absence of light. We figured we had gone maybe half a mile from the nearest campsite, still on the main trail but far enough that we couldn't see or hear anything from the campgrounds anymore. The only sounds were our own quiet footsteps on the dirt path and the faint rustling of the leaves overhead. Then we heard it, soft whispering behind us. At first, I thought it was my friend playing a joke, trying to freak me out, but when I turned my head slightly, I could tell he had gone stiff too. That's when we both instinctively hit our flashlights and spun around. The beams cut through the darkness, catching on the rough bark of the trees and the tangled undergrowth. But there was nothing there, just empty woods, same as before. We stood still for a few seconds, listening, but the whispering had stopped. I tried to tell myself we had imagined it, that it had been the wind moving through the trees in a way that just happened to sound like voices. Maybe it had been some animal shifting in the brush, something small and low to the ground that our lights hadn't caught. That explanation made sense, and we were both ready to accept it and keep moving. Then we heard it again. This time it was louder, still soft, still distant, but unmistakably human. Not the wind, not an animal. We stopped walking, sweeping our flashlights in slow arcs over the trees, checking every shadow, every space between the trunks where someone could be standing. But again, there was nothing. Just more trees, more open space, more of the same. That was the moment when the uneasy feeling really set in, when the dark suddenly felt different than it had a few minutes ago. The woods weren't supposed to have other people in them this far from the campgrounds, at least not this late at night. Something about the sound wasn't normal either. It wasn't someone calling for help, wasn't someone trying to get our attention. It was low and constant, like the person making it didn't care if they were heard or not. Like they were just whispering for the sake of whispering. We didn't talk about it. We didn't need to. We just turned around and started heading back the way we had come, moving faster now, our flashlights cutting through the trees, our breathing suddenly loud in the quiet of the woods. The feeling in my stomach was getting worse with every step. That deep, instinctive unease that tells you something isn't right even when your brain hasn't caught up yet. I knew my friend felt it too. Then we saw her. At first, She was just a shape on the ground, barely visible in the shadows ahead of us. We both froze, our lights locking onto her at the same time. She was crawling. She was on her hands and knees, moving slowly, whispering random words under her breath. Her clothes were dark, almost blending into the dirt, and she was covered in leaves, twigs, and patches of mud. It was like she had been crawling for a long time, dragging herself through the undergrowth without any concern for what she was picking up along the way. I remember the way my stomach dropped when she lifted her head and looked at us, her eyes catching the glare of the flashlights. She didn't look scared. She didn't even look surprised. She just stared at us for a second before slowly standing up, brushing the dirt from her arms, and saying that she was looking for her campsite. That was when I understood what we were dealing with. She wasn't some lost hiker, not some ghostly figure lurking in the woods with bad intentions. She was just drunk. Or high. Or both. We ended up walking her back toward the campgrounds, keeping a few steps ahead of her, occasionally glancing back to make sure she was still following. She kept talking the whole way, muttering to herself, occasionally stumbling, her body language loose and disconnected. It was clear she had been out here for a while, probably wandering in circles, maybe even crawling because she had tripped earlier and just decided that was easier than standing up again. When we finally reached the campground, we started looking for her group, scanning the sites for anyone who might be missing her. It didn't take long to find them. A group of people, probably in their 20s, sitting around a fire, laughing and drinking, completely unaware that one of their friends had been out in the woods on her hands and knees, whispering to the dark. We got her back to them, waited long enough to make sure she wasn't just going to wander off again, and then left. They barely reacted to the fact that she had been missing. As we walked back to our own campsite, I kept thinking about what would have happened if we hadn't gone that far into the woods. If we had decided to turn back earlier, like we usually did, she would have been out there all night, lost and alone, crawling through the dark, whispering to no one, and no one would have even noticed. The helicopter's rotors sent a downdraft of hot wind against my face as I braced myself on the narrow ridge, waiting for the moment to jump. The pilot had the skid balanced on a rock outcrop, the whole machine hovering at a sharp angle, just steady enough for me to disembark without breaking my neck. This wasn't my first drop-off. I'd been at it for days, mapping fire line fuel loads with an IR/LiDAR-equipped drone, tracking where the forest fire was gaining ground and where it had burned itself out. The job was dangerous, but I'd settled into a routine. Get dropped off, set up, fly my route, collect the data, and then call for pickup before the fire shifted. But the second I landed on that ridge, I knew something was off. The space was barely 2 feet wide, and on either side of me, the mountain dropped away in sheer cliffs. There was nowhere to go if the wind shifted wrong or if I lost my balance. The helicopter lifted away as soon as I was clear, the noise of its departure swallowed almost immediately by the wind and the crackling of fire below. I adjusted my stance, keeping my knees slightly bent, and took a slow breath, trying to steady myself. The mountain in front of me was fully ablaze. A wall of flame stretched along the ridgeline, eating through old growth, leaping from treetop to treetop. Smoke poured upward in thick, swirling plumes, darkening the sky, blotting out the sun. Even from my vantage point, high above the worst of it, the heat pressed against my skin, a constant reminder of just how much fire was moving beneath me. I had a job to do. That's what I told myself. I pushed the unease aside and set up the drone, checking the telemetry, making sure everything was functioning the way it should. The wind made it harder than usual, gusts pushing against my equipment, the drone shuddering as it climbed into the sky. But it was working. I watched the screen as the sensors mapped the terrain, outlining hotspots, marking potential fuel loads that would drive the fire forward. 30 minutes later, the drone was back in my hands. I packed up the gear, hefting the 70-pound case, my shoulders already aching from the strain. The smoke had thickened while I'd been working. The ridgeline, which had been visible when I was first dropped off, was now shrouded in a shifting haze. I grabbed the radio, tuning to the pickup frequency. The helicopter was on its way. I could hear it before I could see it. The heavy thump of the rotors cutting through the air, growing louder, then fading. Louder again, then fading once more. Minutes passed. The sound kept coming and going, the pilot trying to find me, trying to find the ridge. Then the call came through. Too much smoke. They couldn't see me. They couldn't see the original drop point. They couldn't see the alternate. They weren't coming. I was on my own. I stood there, gripping the radio, breathing shallowly. The heat, the smoke, the knowledge of just how bad the situation had suddenly become. It all hit me at once. The pilot had suggested I hike northeast. The fire wasn't as bad that way. I looked in that direction, trying to see through the haze, trying to gauge my chances. The ridge I was on wouldn't hold forever. If the wind shifted, the fire could crest the summit, and I'd have nowhere to go. My only option was to move, to get off the ridge and down the mountain before the fire cut off my path completely. I shifted the weight of my pack, adjusting for the heavy case strapped to my back. My legs were already tired, my balance thrown off by the extra weight. But there was no choice. I started moving. The descent was immediate, the trail barely more than a rocky slope leading into the tree line below. The smoke was thick, making my eyes water, clogging my throat. I pulled my shirt over my mouth, trying to breathe through the fabric, but it did little to help. Minutes stretched into an hour. My muscles burned from the effort, sweat mixing with ash, coating my skin. The fire was close, much closer than I wanted it to be. The roar of it was constant, a deep, all-consuming sound. Then came the first tree fall. It happened ahead of me, a massive pine, its trunk already hollowed by fire, finally giving way. It crashed to the ground with a force that shook the slope, throwing embers into the air, sending a wave of fresh heat rolling toward me. I stumbled back, almost losing my footing, my pulse hammering in my ears. I couldn't afford to stop. I had to keep moving. I pushed forward, each step careful, deliberate. The fire was all around me now. Small flames licked at the undergrowth. Burning branches fell unpredictably, crashing into the brush, igniting new pockets of fire. I wasn't moving fast enough. The second tree fall nearly got me. I heard the crack before I saw it, the deep, splintering sound of wood giving way. I turned in time to see a burning tree start to topple, right toward me. There was no thinking, only reacting. I threw myself sideways, hitting the ground hard, rolling down the slope. The impact knocked the air from my lungs, pain flaring through my side, my ribs. The equipment case slammed against my back, the weight nearly crushing me. I hit the dirt and stopped moving. For a second, I couldn't breathe, couldn't process anything beyond the fact that I was still alive. Then I smelled it. Smoke, burnt fabric. My sleeve was on fire. I rolled instinctively, pressing the flames into the dirt, smothering them. The heat seared my arm, but I didn't stop. Couldn't. When I finally got the fire out, I pushed myself up, my whole body aching. My hands were shaking. The pain from my burns was secondary to the adrenaline coursing through me. I kept going. The hike down the mountain felt endless. Every few steps, more debris rained down. Small fires caught on my gear, my clothing. I had to stop again and again to put myself out. I was running out of time. The smoke was thicker, the heat intensifying. The air was so hot it felt like I was breathing fire itself. My vision blurred. My head spun. Then, through the haze, I saw movement. Dark figures moving toward me. Firefighters. They reached me quickly, assessing me with sharp, professional glances. No words were spoken, just action. They helped me walk, guiding me through the burning landscape, leading me to a safe zone where the helicopter was waiting. I barely remember the flight out. I remember the hospital, the doctors checking my burns, the oxygen mask strapped to my face, the exhaustion hitting all at once, pulling me under. 2 days later, I walked out of the hospital, and I was done. I had spent years working in forestry, mapping wildfires, analyzing their behavior. I knew the dangers, but that day I lived them, and I knew without a doubt that I would never do it again. The people who fight these fires, who walk into them voluntarily, who battle against the elements with nothing but their training and their sheer force of will, they are built differently. They are a different breed, and I will never stop respecting them for it.